Turning to row 3, evaluate sources and evidence. This row is looking at the sources the students have used. Note though, in row 1, the judgment is whether the bibliography allows for complex context. Row 3 judges the incremental examples of evidence presented to gauge whether they are well selected and well used. Is evidence given in a specific part of the report from a relevant, credible source? For example, is an academic source used to say something substantial or something general and easy? Is a newspaper, with no explanation of relevance and credibility, used as a source for study results? Relevance and credibility need to be tethered to the particular evidence being presented. Remember that the evaluation of credibility of sources and selection of relevant evidence can be evidenced in two ways, through direct explanation or through purposeful use, in this case, the deployment of evidence from a high-quality source. Let's look at the report, The Psychological Effects of Terrorism, or Sample 2. This report uses evidence from credible journalistic sources, but it treats all the evidence used equally despite its origin. For example, on page 2, the report uses evidence from Kruger in The American Economist to refute the idea that poverty is a reason people join terrorist organizations. The American Economist is a peer-reviewed academic source, so this is a successful example of purposeful use, but unfortunately the only one in the report. On page 3, it uses the report in the International Business Times of a propaganda video published by ISIS to support the claim that not all terrorists are sociopaths or have mental health issues. The report mentions that it is a propaganda video and then unquestioningly accepts the information given in it. The report doesn't do the necessary work of validating the video source. For example, where did the International Business Times get the video and what was their interest in reporting on it? Has it been authenticated? Have there been any comments on the video by counterterrorism experts? The International Business Times would potentially be a good source for reporting on business information, but there is no clear reason why it would be a strong, credible source in this context. Both these pieces of evidence are treated in the same way, despite their varying degrees of relevance and credibility for this context. Further examples of this can be seen on page 4 of the report. You can see that sources from PBS and supposedly the History Channel are used in the same way. The problem with using news sources is that even credible news sources are seen as slanting left or right. And is PBS the best source for the specific evidence presented in this case? News sources are often shortcuts in getting information, but they require a lot more explaining to justify their use in the IRR. Similarly, the History Channel may be wonderfully entertaining and smart, but it is questionable that it should be used as a hard source in this context, although it would be a great source if considering how history gets translated or presented to a new audience. So, in this report, there isn't consistent evidence of purposeful use in this example. That's to say, demonstration that the evidence used was clearly thought through in terms of credibility, and there is no direct explanation given. That lack of consistency in the choice of evidence used, or uneven treatment of sources, is the mark of a 4 or a medium score in this row. One other point illustrated by this example is the fact that all elements of a citation need to be listed so that the quality of the source can be easily discerned. In this example, it's not entirely clear if history means the History Channel or not. If the person scoring can't tell the kind of source that's being used, it's difficult to evaluate the quality of evidence. Now compare the uneven demonstration of credibility and relevance in the Psychological Effects of Terrorism sample we just saw with the Rhino Horns report. Here you can see that this report demonstrates the credibility of sources and relevance of the evidence used throughout. In the example you see here, the report combines evidence from several credible sources to show the law on rhino horns is not being enforced by the Vietnamese government. This report repeatedly applies apt and credible source material to support its research and so scores a 6 or high on this row. Now read through the summary of what to look for in row 3. Another thing to think about when making judgments in this row is that it's important that the report shows that the student understands both how to evaluate evidence contained within sources and how to evaluate the sources themselves. Particularly in the 4 or medium range, the report might show evidence that the student has evaluated the evidence, but has not fully considered the origin of that evidence. This situation frequently arises when the report uses newspaper sources to report hard data or studies. While the evidence may be evaluated for relevance and credibility, the source, the Huffington Post or New York Times, USA Today or History Channel, has not been explicitly discussed. When reports rely on journalistic sources to make scholarly arguments, the student needs to establish credibility to score high on this row. Now read through the summary of what to look for in row 3. Another thing to think about when making judgments in this row is that it's important that the report shows that the student understands both how to evaluate evidence contained within sources and how to evaluate the sources themselves. Particularly in the 4 or medium range, the report might show evidence that the student has evaluated the evidence, but has not fully considered the origin of that evidence. This situation frequently arises when the report uses newspaper sources to report hard data or studies. While the evidence may be evaluated for relevance and credibility, the source, the Huffington Post or New York Times, USA Today or History Channel, has not been explicitly discussed. When reports rely on journalistic sources to make scholarly arguments, the student needs to establish credibility to score high on this row.